is part of why I'm excited to talk about them today. So I don't want to, oh yeah, we will be recording. I don't want to preempt too much of the discussion, and I don't want to repeat too much of the short editorial intros that should be in the PDFs, both for the 1946 political fragments, which is what I'll call them for short, and the 1942 schemata. So I just want to say a few things about the context and content of both pairs of fragments. And the argument that I'm going to be making is that by looking at the context in which they were written and then at their contents, my hope is that we can see both how the fragments fit into the bigger project of dialectic of enlightenment and the development of critical theory in the 1940s. And then I hope that through that contextualization, we'll be able to recontextualize better known pieces like Dialectic of Enlightenment, Minimum Moralia, some of their other 1940s works in particular, against its prevailing interpretation, considering that I think the 42 schemata, the 44 Adorno's Contrapolum, and then the 46 political fragments show that sort of on both sides of the majority of the writing for Dialectic of Enlightenment, we find a commitment both to the Marxian critique of political economy and a commitment to revolutionary socialism. So, to start off with the 46 political fragments, the context of these fragments seems to be October 1946. I'll try not to get too much into the archival details. I had a very close friend and confidant inform me not to just speak like someone who's been doing archival research and been in the weeds for so long, so I will try to avoid that. But these were written in around 1946 with some other pieces that have been published elsewhere in Horkheimer's Gesammelte Schriften, for instance. And there's the only quote that I will read today is from the conversations that Adorno and Horkheimer had in October 1946 about the planned second installment or part two of Dialectic of Enlightenment, what they called, again, the Dialectics book or Dialectics project. And so in the second of these conversations that they have, this has also been published in Horkheimer's Gesammelte Schriften. Horkheimer at one point will say, we see this moment of unity, the concrete unity of politics and philosophy, in holding on to the radical impulses of Marxism and really of the Enlightenment as a whole. For the rescue of the Enlightenment is our concern, without identifying ourselves with any empirically existing party or group. In a certain sense, it is a materialism which renounces the prejudice that any one moment of existing material reality is immediately positive. The paradox, the dialectical secret of true politics, consists in the adoption of a critical standpoint which does not hypostasize itself as positive. And then there's, I'll share this in the chat as well. It is slightly too long for the chat. So this is the quotes, and it's followed by a section where they do sort of a neither nor. And this is pretty characteristic of their, political position at the time, which is that they refuse just to critique Russia, but not liberal democracy in its relationship to fascism, which at one point Horkheimer says at the time is like one of the defining characteristics of critical theory. But they also refuse to go easy on Soviet Russia. And this is the position that they'll try to maintain throughout the late 1940s. This is also what we find in the 1946 political fragments themselves, which I hope we'll get to talk more about. I imagine that people will have a lot to say about some of their very strange observations and hypotheticals about the immediate future of revolutionary politics in late 1946. This is one of those where Chris, who is here, Chris O'Kane, was like, well, I want whatever they were smoking in 1946 to think that international proletarian revolution was so possible at that point. Yeah, same. It's remarkably optimistic. And there are also some strange comments. I was talking with Andy about this in advance a few weeks ago, And Andy was like, well, I don't really understand why they would have this hypothetical, but if I guess you set it up this way, yeah, the successful communist revolution by the revolutionary proletariat in the US would require them maybe to declare war against the Russian state alongside the revolutionary Russian proletariat in order to achieve world communism. But again, not sure why that's the first hypothetical that they would jump to. So again, I'm excited to talk about some of like the weird proposals they have. It's not exactly a program, but it's definitely not a program. It's more than just a negative outline of what they think needs to happen next. So this neither nor is again, it's something that's going to come up in several other places in their work from around late 1946. There's going to be a debate that they have with two of their co-authors of the last thesis 7 of the elements on anti-Semitism, limits of enlightenment from dialectic of enlightenment, Leo Lewenthal and Paul Massing, both of whom are going to be upset that Horkheimer and Adorno aren't going as hard on Soviet Russia as they should be. And Lewenthal and Massing want to push for more of that criticism, not to ease up necessarily on the criticism of liberal democracies, but Adorno and Horkheimer refuse. And so the section that was in one of the 1944 prints where Horkheimer's recounting an experience of going to the 37 World's Fair and seeing, France host, the great pavilions with the Nazi one on one side and the Soviet one on the other, and being really fucking bummed out about it. That passage is going to be cut from this, and Lewenthal is going to be like, you should put that back in, and they won't do it. Uh, Especially because they think that it's more pressing for them to critique the relationship between liberal democracies and fascism in the context of the United States when they're publishing it in the late 40s. So again, this neither nor appears in other places. There are a few other pieces, like I said, that have been published from October 1946. Seems like it was a very productive month for them. There's also a connection that I would mention to some theses that Marcuse writes in 1947 on the tasks of post-war critical theory, where he like calls for a new council republic, where he is intervening in some of the same debates that Adorno and Horkheimer will wade into in these 46 political fragments. So those are very strange, and I'll make sure that people have access to those as well. I can share that during the discussion section or in the materials. So there are a few things I think that are worth flagging about the 46 political fragments before we get in to the material itself. So the first question, to return to Andy's great question on what is with this hypothetical of the relationship between the revolutionary proletariat in the United States and the revolutionary proletariat in Soviet Russia? How are they thinking about this alliance? And this is something where I haven't been able to find tons on why they were motivated to do this, except for a few comments that Horkheimer makes in early materials for Society and Reason, which would become Eclipse of Reason. There, he has a way of introducing, it's in the Revival of Dogmatism, which was written as a standalone English language essay, the critique of positivism or logical empiricism and neo-Thomism. It would later be incorporated into Eclipse as the second chapter, Conflicting Panaceas. In the early version, though, he stages the entire piece through a surprise encounter between a soldier from like further West Europe, I think actually like England or the United States, and then like a Russian who find themselves allies, standing over like the ruins of Germany or something like that. And this is supposed to be what opens up the reflection for him there. So aside from that, I'm not entirely sure what political reference they would have had in mind, immediate political reference. So I'm interested to hear what people think about that. I also know that their belief in revolutionary potentials in the United States labor force against the trade union bureaucracy, which they critique, of course, extensively in their racket theory from the early 1940s, as well as in these 246 fragments. That actually came from their work for the labor study, Anti-Semitism in American Labor, from 1944 to 45. And it's typically regarded as a very pessimistic thing. Oh, the workers are so racist, and this is why they don't want to publish it. Later on, Martin Jay advocates for that line. It turns out not to be the case. Uh, Adorno actually was still trying to publish it in the mid 50s, like a decade after the first big draft, which is more than 900 pages. And the reason it didn't get published seems to be because Adorno hated all of the revisions that Paul Lazarsfeld made to the manuscript. And so they fought about it for about 10 years instead of publishing it. And then it got sort of lost. But anyway, that project in particular has a lot of insights into the radical character of certain groups within American labor. And that seems to be informing some of their understanding of why it is that they believe in the possibility of a revolutionary proletariat within the United States against the labor unions. It has to do with the labor study. But again, I think a lot of this still has to be reconstructed because the first time I read this, I was like, again, what are they smoking? So not entirely sure what the reference are. Again, it would be interesting to hear what people think. There is in the materials for the racket, there's a fragment from 1944 where Horkheimer primarily writes. It's called The History of the American Labor Force. The historical course of the proletariat led to a crossroads. It would become a class or a racket, or it could become a class or a racket. Racket meant privileges within national borders. Class meant world revolution. The leaders have relieved the proletariat of this decision. So they are very consistent in that sense about sort of their diagnosis of the problem of the compromise of the radical workers movement throughout the 1940s. Surprisingly consistent, actually. So then there's, the question also connected to the rackets of the defeat of the labor movement in part through, again, what they call rackets and the formation of rackets in trade unions or intra-class conflict between proletarians, employed, unemployed, in developed versus undeveloped countries. This is where Horkheimer will go as far, even in Eclipse, as saying that the defeat of the traditional workers' movement for these reasons completes the reification of man. It's one of his most pessimistic points that he makes in the entire book. And it's because of this defeat of the revolutionary side of the workers' movement. The other interesting thing I think to highlight, I think there are two more things that I want to talk about these fragments in particular, and then we'll see how we're feeling, whether we want to talk about the 42 schemata, is the problem of their Leninism. So the position that they adopt here, which is precisely what Lenin originally meant by dictatorship, they still seem to have, especially a negative vision of what the dictatorship of the proletariat is, based on Marcuse's theses, which they are very enthusiastic about from around the same time. They tend to think, it seems, that the dictatorship of the proletariat is necessary in the post-revolutionary period in order for power to be handed over to the Soviets as quickly as possible. And so this is where they, are they council communists? Are they Leninists? They don't make those kinds of distinctions, especially because they were sort of, there on the ground. Horkheimer, at the very least, was for revolutionary Munich. And so they are thinking about things sort of before a lot of those distinctions come into play. This is also why they're never going to be as principled councilists, despite maintaining the councilist position, as someone like Karl Korsch. And they're going to disagree with Korsch's assessment on Lenin, for instance. So what about, the appearance of Lenin here, which also seems to sort of come out of nowhere? They are going to defend at several points in the 1930s a non-anarchist and a non-fascist concept of authority, which seems to be linked in their own notes and in their correspondence to a certain understanding of the role of the party, which we'll get to, especially with Contra Polum. But even into the 40s, Horkheimer is going to be defending Lenin as late as like 1943 in writing, in a critical letter that he writes to Heinrich Grossman about their differences and specifically about the method of the critique of political economy. Horkheimer is going to name drop effectively Lenin's Imperio criticism, Materialism and Imperio criticism, which Horkheimer wrote but never published a review of in the late 20s. And he sort of thinks of this, its two-pronged attack against positivist scientism and supernaturalism. Horkheimer is going to repeat that in some form throughout the 40s. This is what chapter 2 of Eclipse of Reason, Conflicting Panaceias is going to be, with the critique of logical empiricism and of neo-Thomism. But Adorno is going to defend Lenin specifically in the context of psychoanalysis, interestingly enough, in the defense of sort of the kind of authority that Freud has in the analytic situation against Fromm's criticism of the coldness of Freud. And so Adorno is going to be pretty consistent about that throughout the late 30s. And he's going to he thinks that to make any progress in psychoanalysis in the late 1930s, at one point he says that people should read State and Revolution, as opposed to what he takes to be a romantic and anarchist tendency that he finds in Fromm and that he finds in like Reich, for instance. So the last thing I think for these fragments is about the role of the critique of political economy for critical theory as sort of its model, the mode of knowing, as Horkheimer will call it, on which critical theory is based. And so again, this is going to be something that they will maintain throughout the mid-40s. Even in some late notes that Adorno makes to himself, he'll say, dialectic of enlightenment is critique of political economy. Again, a very strong claim. But I think that I wanted to introduce that as a last point, just as a problem. And in part, this is where I would transition to talking about the 1942 schemata, where the critique of political economy is important for their understanding of the figure of the dialectic of enlightenment itself. So recently stumbled across in their 1940s materials for state capitalism, which was the first name of the authoritarian state. Adorno wrote it with Horkheimer in 1940 and contributed so much to it. He was originally listed as co-author. I'm not entirely sure why he wasn't included on there. Same thing with Horkheimer and several of Adorno's essays from that time. They were really locked in, as they called it, that little room upstairs, where apparently they would just do this stuff for hours and hours and hours. But there, in those notes, we get what they call Marx's basic idea. The inhumanity of the capitalistic system consists in the exchange of the human being as commodified labor power. Its escape, the escape of this system, is the fundamental motive of Marxist philosophy, to escape a world in which like is exchanged for like. This is the engine of myth, the principle of equivalence. This is effectively going to be the thesis of especially the second of the 1942 schemata, which I've titled Spirit of Enlightenment, which was written as one of the earliest drafts for the first chapter of, again, what would become Dialectic of Enlightenment. I'm not entirely sure why it wasn't used, but a lot of the themes repeat in the book itself and are repurposed for the chapter that would eventually be retitled Concept of Enlightenment for the 1947 publication. Otherwise, and this is the other one of the two, if people got a chance to read those, this would be on the relation between the domination of nature and social domination. This is where Adorno and Horkheimer, again, interestingly enough, emphasize and foreground Marx precisely on those points where the traditional reception of critical theory says they break with Marx. So aside from the fact that they have sort of a Marxian approach to conceptualizing the dialectic of enlightenment as a conceptual figure, they're also going to find Marx on both sides of the antinomy that they set up there, or the dialectic they set up there, between two different positions on explaining domination and accounting for domination. Is it that we can explain the domination of nature by reference to social domination? Or is it that we can sort of account for the fact of social domination given natural power relations? And that's going to set up the first of the two schemata from 1942. So, yeah, I think the only thing I would say in conclusion is it turns out that uh, they were pretty vocally supportive of what they considered a Leninist position throughout the 30s into the late 40s. This is also despite what late Horkheimer himself will say. Uh, on certain occasions, we don't have to. I have my own problems. I have a lot of problems with him. I won't get into those now. Um, but they'll endorse that. They don't see the Leninist gesture as fundamentally incompatible with what's a kind of councilist commitment, where they take the all power to the Soviets thing deadly seriously. And this is sort of the way that they think they can combine the Leninist dictatorship of the proletariat with a version of the Republic of Councils, which is something that, again, they will explicitly endorse. Adorno will, I know, in the 1942 Theses on Need, for instance. So they're also, Marx is, and the critique of political economy as a model informs the conceptual figure of dialectic of enlightenment itself before the book begins. Marx is going to be one of their key interlocutors for thinking about the relationship between the domination of nature and social domination. And again, we're going to find this commitment to critique of political economy and to revolutionary socialism and even the project of communism in the materials from before dialectic of enlightenment and after. And I think what's interesting is that Contra Paulum is going to be probably the most explicit political statement we'll get from them the entire 1940s, um, except for maybe these 46 fragments. And there we're going to see, right before the publication of Dialectic of Enlightenment itself, probably one of the least ambiguous endorsements of this is where Adorno will say the thing there, and this is why I'm excited to talk about it with you. As a now unpopular author once said, any cook can govern, and he's going to be throwing out lines like that in a debate with Paul Tillich about the status of religious socialism in 1944. So, anyway, I hope that helped in terms of the context of the 46 political fragments and the 42 schemata. Um, Hopefully, at the very least, I've broached a lot of the biggest problems or questions that people have with the text, even if I have not been able to come up with any answer for them, uh, or provide any answer for them in these short remarks. But yeah, I'm excited to hear what people think about these.
Amazing. Thank you, James. Okay, cool. So we could maybe jump to the Q&A slash group discussion. I'm hoping it can kind of be both. So feel free to either direct a comment or question towards James, or in the spirit of this being an ongoing sort of group discussion over four sessions, feel free also just to raise a question or comment generally for the group to consider. I mean, we're a little bit large as a Zoom room, so we may not be able to get into like one-on-one back and forths too much, but I think, as long as we all mind our manners. But okay, so maybe the way we'll do that is just feel free to raise your hand at any point. I'm not going to call on people, but that way it could just be, self self-organizing a bit. Um, and then if it gets too confusing, I'll step in as the necessary Freudian figure of authority. Um, so okay, cool. Take it away, someone else.
All right, so we got a question in the chat from Jerome, which is are Adorno and Horkheimer for the joint dictatorship of the proletariat of oppressed nations. And honestly, one of the most surprising things about this piece was that paragraph towards the end, which is what I imagine you have in mind here. Um, the two paragraphs towards the end. One of them where they're talking about reclaiming or recovering in a critical sense Hitler's concept of the proletarian nation against white supremacy. Um, yeah, I was not expecting to find these in a piece of writing of theirs in 1946. I think that this is one of those places where, for similar reasons that we're going to find in Contrapolum, when they're talking about how the party has the possibility of, representing genuine universality because it avows itself as a particular, and it doesn't pretend to be sort of a universal party already. This, I think there's another kind of logic like this at work here, where they're concerned with the possibility of real universality, which they identify with the possibility of a communist international, and they don't think that that has been achieved in the 1940s. And so this is where I think that for them here, especially when it comes to the question of uh, these non, I guess what would eventually be called first world countries or these non-global north countries, they explicitly name, and I think this is by reference to especially recent communist strike actions at the time um, in Malaysia. They're going to refer to like events popping off in Malaysia, and they're going to say they would not need to repeat the game of, like the ascendant bourgeoisie. They won't have to repeat that if there is like a real international. So the international then is going to appear on both sides of sort of like the national question for them, which is that successful anti-colonial or national revolutions would presuppose the existence of an international and would lead to a genuine international. And so this is the point that they're going to enter in. And I think that yeah, I do want to hear what other people have to say about these sections though. Um, because it is a very distinct position and it's one that they will sort of push and entertain in their own correspondence the late the late 1940s. But yeah, then there was a hand. Who was the next person with the hand?
I
It
believe it
was
was
me, but
Jake.
yeah, but there's another question in the chat if you want to take that first.
Oh no, go ahead, Jake. Then I'll come back to Alexi's question.
Okay. Well, this is super interesting, James. Thank you. Um, I was wondering if Trotsky shows up in the archive at all, because it seems like shadowboxing with Trotskyism could answer a few of the disparate questions here, where like, particularly in the US, Trotskyism is like a mainstream heterodox Marxism that has some purchase among Jewish intellectuals of the time, and that actually like people think of the Trotskyist opposition to the Popular Front and as like spurring a lot of the New York intellectuals to the right. I could see this piece defending Popular Frontism after the fact, or the overtures to Lenin, or even like the kind of like disdain for the third worldisms as shadowboxing with Trotsky. But I don't know if they actually care about that current at all, especially in New York. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, this is something that I've been wondering for a long time also, which is why Trotskyism doesn't appear more prominently in their, like even in their correspondence in the 30s and 40s. It's sort of on the horizon, but it's never something that they identify with. I think because they think they have a more bespoke, heterodox Leninism, like a take on Lenin, but also on Marx than Trotsky has, which is it's too mainstream of an opposition for them. Um, so they also just fight, like with Sidney Hook for a lot of the 1940s. And they have beef with, I think, one or two Trotskyist papers. Thomas Wheatland talks about that in the Frankfurt School in Exile. But I think that, and this is as a great question, I think that it might be that who they're referencing at the beginning of the curse of writing today, when they talk about Herr Shapiro would say to Herr Cohn, have you read H&A's rather interesting criticism yet? In, the hypothetical situation where they're exhorting the reader to incest, that might be Meyer Shapiro, a Trotskyist. And so like who they did like put into contact with Benjamin, I think in the late 30s. So, Trotskyism is there, and so are Trotskyist figures. But yeah, it's interesting that there's not a more explicit, even sort of critical stance towards Trotskyism as like a left opposition tendency. It just seems like they don't identify with it. Um, Definitely not with its existing institutions or representatives, whether it's papers or it's going to be, uh, yeah, whether it's going to be like Trotskyist papers in New York, or whether it's going to be specific, Trotskyist intellectuals. But yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, and I do not have a better answer for you, other than it's there, but it's not very loud and it's not very noticeable. So I think this may have also been in part because their preferred left oppositional tendency within the communist tradition was still going to be something more like councilism. And so like that is where they would, probably rather side with, even if they have their disagreements with Korsch and Matic. Korsch at one point writes in, I think, 39 to Matic, he's like, well, basically, I think he singles out Horkheimer, agrees with us. And he's like, and most of the others do too. It's just that this doesn't appear in their writings because of their double entry bookkeeping. Yeah, I think it's also because they were Germans. Like their left oppositional position is, again, their bespoke communist position is going to be a version of councilism. So yeah, I think that probably accounts for it.
It does, just quickly, it does seem like in on page 7, the middle paragraph, that American workers believe the most advanced country on earth should carry out a revolution without at the same time assuming responsibility for the earth as a whole is almost as narrow-minded as the idea of socialism in one country. Seems like it could be like an after the fact defense of, a successful left, even heterodox left would have to join the war against Germany, or like would have to have some kind of uh, global aim, or it just seems like clearly a fight with a Trotskyist line against popular frontism.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think they're going to be critical of, there are other pieces from around right before World War II breaks out and then, immediately after, where they're going to talk like, well, we can't really even tell the difference between peace and war anymore right now because of what peace looks like as long as Nazi Germany is allowed to continue to do what it's doing. And so like I think that they are, like pretty explicitly critical. Even when they're critical of, Stalin's USSR, they're like, well, we hope they kill a lot of Nazis, like that's that's what we've come to. But God, I hope they win. Like that's in their correspondence around the time. So yeah, I think it is interesting that they do think that there has to be like war against Germany. And I think that that was probably, yeah, that's a really good point. I gotta write that down so I can try to track this stuff better. But yeah, thank you. Oh, I sorry, I forgot there was a whole nother question already in the chat. However, we must also be careful not to follow Marx in endorsing the historical process as a whole simply because it leads to harmony through revolution, for instance. Humanity cannot realize paradise with bloody hands. Yeah, what does it mean lead to harmony through revolution? They think that Marx is of two minds about the relationship between history and the revolution. And it's a lot like Benjamin's comment in the materials for Theses on the Philosophy of History, which is that Marx said revolutions are the motor of history. What if it's throwing the handbrake, on like the runaway train, where it is both Benjamin's way of situating himself within the tradition of revolutionary Marxism, um, and it is sort of a critique of the ambivalence in Marx between, is revolution the culmination of historical progress and a continuation of it, or is it a radical interruption? And again, they find Marx on both of those sides. This is something that Horkheimer is going to talk about in the 43 letter to Grossman, but it's going to feature especially prominently in Contra Polum. where Adorno is going to have that line, which is about Marx did go after utopia, perhaps more than he should have. But for them, the revolutionary moment is a utopian moment. It is stepping outside of, in that sense, it's the lateral move out of history. Um, and so that seems to be what they're talking about. And so they'll combine critiques, 43 letter to Grossman. Okay, J.E. Yes. Well, I mentioned it before where he's criticizing Grossman and talking about the critique of political economy. Um, but yeah, I will also share that right now. That's where there's going to be a really fascinating quote from Horkheimer, which I think is relevant exactly to this question, which is this. It's the conclusion to the letter, which is that Marx did not combat utopianism out of deference to the objective tendency, but because on the basis of that very objective tendency, utopia appeared to him within reach. And here's my latest pass at the translation for people who are interested in that. Um, but yeah, I think that this is where, again, much like they're going to sometimes think that Marx is, on the right track, and other times they're going to say in the same breath um, that he falls below his own theoretical insight. Like this is something that they'll talk about in the one of the 1942 schemata, where it's going to be like there's a point where they're going to be like, well, sometimes Marx just sounds like a positivist naturalist, and that's the point where you have to turn his own better insight against him. Uh, it's going to be very similar with the status of historical progress and the relationship between progress and revolution in their 1940s works. So that seems to be the point about leading to harmony through revolution, which is a debate about the concept of, revolution itself. Is it a continuation of historical progress? Is it the interruption? Are revolutions the motor of history, or are revolutions, the attempt to throw the handbrake that has just never like fully taken? They're the aborted interruptions of history that appear within it, kind of thing. Does that answer the question? Okay, cool.
I think we have open floor. Maybe while everyone mulls, I also had a question for partially, I guess, directly for you, James, but I am curious everyone's impression in this group more generally about this passage in the schemata. I think it's on 56. Um, I know there have been some, maybe going back to my question about, I don't know, presumably at least um, m- some of us have some familiarity with this thing called value form theory, or like this recent sort of, whether it's like Postone, Heinrich, endnotes even maybe, um, where there's this question of sort of the object shifting from something like proletarian socialism and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Um, and they'll claim Adorno and Horkheimer as, or especially Adorno, as the sort of initiator of German value form theory and this different way of thinking about it. And that suddenly the proletarian socialist movement appears instead as affirming the dimension of labor as a commodity and actually not revolutionary with respect to, or not a viable revolutionary path with respect to Marxism either, to take depending on your value theorist, either historically because of the decomposition of the proletariat and their organizations, or necessarily, perhaps. And so I was thinking about this, and this has been critiqued by a few people. Like, at Berkeley, we had Christopher Nealon, who made this point about Adorno's opposition to, or what can appear to be an equivalence drawn between um, sort of identitarian thinking, or the processes of identity implicit in exchange, this kind of question of what we really want to get beyond is, say, um, the sort of identity relation implicit in exchange, which can seem like a kind of esoteric political proposition. Um, I suppose I was interested in this version of this that appears in the schemata on 56. Um, or I guess maybe it starts at the bottom of 55. And this might even link to Jake's session next time, which is going to have Adorno's interesting introduction of this idea of immanent use value as a system immanent, or no, exchange value as a system immanent concept, and use value as a system transcendent concept in Marx's critique of political economy. Okay, so enough uh, prelude. So at the bottom of 55. They write, the absolute is stripped of all content until nothing remains but the sheer unity of immanence, while the reduction to abstract unity cancels the injustices of the old inequality of privilege. It at the same time fulfills them, as according to an expression of Kierkegaard's, it cuts off the incommensurable. The injustice disguised in the exchange of equivalence affects even the logical form of the world ordered according to equivalence, abstraction. Abstraction is carried out under the dictates of value, which establishes a universal relationship between commodities. The sole justice done to the objects subjected to its abstraction rests in the fact that the violence done unto them is also done unto others they've been equated with. But this justice is injustice, its execution is universal destitution, integration into the system of comparability. And later down, they make this clear that this is what Marx denounces as the fateful necessity of bourgeois society. The unity of exchange is average labor time. And later on, they go down to elaborate what they say. They say rect is unrect, that right or law is unright or law or unlaw, implicitly. Um, and yeah, so I guess my main question is how James, you or anyone else here regards how exactly one can commensurate something like this take, which would say, some might read this as saying, this is opposing a politics of bourgeois rights, which is what Lenin will base the dictatorship of the proletariat on in State and Revolution. Um, or one, what struck me reading this in their sort of implicit thesis antithesis structure to the dialectic of enlightenment is that there's a kind of way that they're maintaining some fidelity to bourgeois right, even as they're critiquing its immanent characteristics. And thus, there's some way of maintaining both something like this more sophisticated value theoretical position while also redeeming what would be what I think most value form theorists would still regard as a traditional Marxism, say, of state and revolution. Um, but I just wonder if how we all feel about this question of either the viability of what they seem to be inaugurating here as a more abstract um, opposition to identity and the identity implicit in exchange, they argue, um, and whether how we make sense of this as a mediating moment in that entire tradition, given their claim of a lineage or a sort of root in Lenin, versus how they become the root for a tradition that would not take up that earlier tradition.
Yeah, this is the abolition of the law of value as like the JDPON kind of thing. Like there are moments in what they talk about here that do sound like that. And it's also, I wanted to say, and I'm glad you brought this up, Andy, it's because there are these weird moments in the schemata where it sounds like they're also, when they argue against, the fateful necessity of bourgeois capitalist society, average labor time, and sort of this process of abstraction, it sometimes seems like they're defending like concrete existing being. They'll even use like the language of Dasein and Daseienden, Seienden, nicht Seienden. Like there's a lot of ontological language also in the schemata fragments. Um, but I think I would say two things. I think one of the interesting things here, and this is I'm I'm less conversant in the question of right and law than I think other people here will be. So I'll keep it in that sense. A little bit more philosophical. One of the points I would make is that they will still do like in the at the end of cursive writing today, which has the line which this is definitely something that comes from Adorno, the one on the ant colony. The fully reified society. Yeah, it's on page 10 of those fragments. Radical self-alienation of the human being, thereby the absolutely negative. This signifies at the same time so nearly utopia. The fully reified society is infinitely close to the concept of humanity. The ant colony is a projection of those who prepare it but repress it from their consciousness. Its conscious induction could coincide with its abolition. And so I think there will be something like, what is it that I'm trying to remember who said it. Was it Krakauer who was like the problem with capitalist society is that it doesn't rationalize enough? And there's going to be something like that where they'll maintain that like a defensive abstraction at the same time, and where they're not going to think that there's an outside in something like concrete being, which also gets to your question of system immanent and system transcendent principles, which is why I'm very excited to talk with Jake about that next week. Um, but especially because in the schemata here, there's the section on, or I'm pretty sure I left in the word because there's no great way to translate all of the German ontological language. I have still not figured it out. Zayenden, Nick Zayenden. I stole from the way that certain people translate Schelling, um, which again shows a little bit too much of my background there, as what has or does not have being. But when they talk about existing here in the end, and they've talked about, like the problem of abstraction and social domination for most of Spirit of Enlightenment, then they get towards the end and they say that the problem is, though, is that this kind of abstraction is still too much like sheer existence. It ends up being the reflections form of bare, brute existence, because the appeal to concrete existence outside of abstraction is itself abstract. And that's, the place where they're going to conclude in this schemata here, which I think is fairly consistent. So I don't know how it'll shake out with the lecture material we'll be reading next week. But it does seem like that kind of appeal to, concreteness, concrete existing or ontology is precluded for them because of this reflective structure of sheer existence and fully abstract enlightenment that seeks to transcend it and reproduces it in that gesture, which is sort of, the vicious dialectical movement that they'll be outlining in Spirit of Enlightenment here. So yeah, I can't answer the question about law necessarily, which is fascinating because they're actually going to be quoting from like legal scholars here also, um, on like the history of law and its relationship to retribution, something which also shows up in their racket theory fragments from around the time. So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm interested to hear what other people think.
While Martin rephrases what sounds like a good question, I'd be interested to hear anyone respond to it. Please, people take the floor with whatever more or less formulated questions or comments you might have.
I'll ask a question. Um, so I know Crane, so I know he'll forgive me because I'm going to try to put the what's the term? Push him into the fire a little bit here. Um, so I'm particularly asking about the two more political fragments, the relationship between the critical intellectuals and the cursive writing. And I would like your opinion as James Crane, person existing in the 21st century, um, rather than as the sort of intellectual historian per se. What do you think these texts? I won't even say what do you think. I will say, do you think that these have any sort of emphatic political meaning for us today? And if so, what is it?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say here, I think, and this is, this gets back to Andy's question also, which I will rephrase part of to use as my answer, because I think it was a good way of putting it, which is that for them, there is no distinction between what they take to be revolutionary international socialism that looks like a radicalization of the workers' movement along different lines in a way that can respond to the compromises internal to the workers' movement historically, along the lines of employed, unemployed, developed, underdeveloped countries, that sort of thing. Also, gender relations and the relationship to children and animals. All of these things come up in their criticisms of the failure of the radical workers' movement on its own terms. Um, but they think that this is part and parcel with um, it's like, to you again, the joke phrase I think I threw out earlier, following Jerome's suggestion of the JDPON, which is like JDPON for the abolition of the value form. And like this is uh, uh, one of the things where I think I would say, like, what does it mean when they talk about the escape, which has to be like a universal escape from this universal system? And I think that for them, this will look more like a revolutionary movement with international solidarity, which they're still committed to at this point, against, on the one hand, just the identification with AES, actually existing socialism, and on the other hand, with what they take to be problematic about the pure opposition position to AES, which they find in those of their colleagues Massing and Lewenthal at the time, I know, both of whom have, I think, stronger commitments and fit alongside sometimes people like Korsch and Maddock, who are more libertarian communists. They neither nor those positions. So concrete political content, um, none. But the reason that there's none is because that's the benefit of the fragments, which is that they challenge you to occupy that kind of neither nor position. Um, which for them also looked like critical solidarity with socialist movements in other places. So, yeah, I guess I would say right now, what importance do they have for us right now? Is I think that the impossible position that they occupy is one that is worth trying to, it seems like to me. Uh, and I think that that does come out especially strong in these very bizarre political fragments from 46. So I think that, yeah, I think it's a very unique neither nor position, which is not the kind of position that I would have expected from them, and is not, and this is, I think, one of the most important things, is not the kind of both sidesing of, some of the later comments that they'll make after the return to West Germany. And, some of the comments they'll make, there's this moment in, and I'm very critical of the moment in Adorno's History and Freedom lectures where he's talking about, I think it's in the Congo, and he's talking about Belgian paratroopers dropping in, And he's saying that, surely, the colonial power committed atrocities, but there were also atrocities on the ground. Oh, I just didn't think they were thinking about politics to respond to your question, Dan. I just didn't think that they were that this was, at the forefront of their minds, not because politics wasn't important, but because I thought their energies were elsewhere. Um, but Adorno's going to make this comment and he's going to say things where the neither nor in that case in the History and Freedom lectures does sound too much like an apology for the existing order, which is, the kind of criticism of revolutionary movements that late Horkheimer, when he's an explicit anti-communist, will adopt, which is that the attempt to stage a revolution against the violence of the existing order only repeats that violence at best. Uh, Otherwise, it's, like even worse. And so sometimes Adorno will sound like that, but in the same lecture, Adorno concludes with a critique of Hegel because he's talking about the perspective that the philosophy of history allows you, which is one of not immediately identifying with any empirically existing, political group like they line out, I think, in the 46 fragments. And there, Adorno is going to say, of course, this is possible because Hegel himself can identify with all groups in a certain sense and be magnanimous and generous because he won and his side won. And, like he gets to stand on the ruins of history and be like, well, I see your point and I see yours. And I think that this also cuts against Adorno's own tendency earlier in that same lecture when he's talking about the Congo. And so I think that this is more explicit and is all contained within these 246 fragments. Which is that it's a neither nor, but it's not a neither nor that affords you the possibility of the position of a conscientious objector. And I think that that is what is interesting about these to me. Um, and I think that that is something that would be a good corrective for a lot of tendencies today. So yeah, that is, I guess, all I got. I don't know if that sounded like bullshit.
We have one from Martin and one from Jake. Martin's is about the question of myth and sort of the sociological concept of strategic positionality. So maybe, James, if you feel especially like you want to jump on that one, you could do so, or because it also seems like a tough question, this figure of myth and figuring out how to extrapolate concrete, either political or sort of social research type conclusions out of it. So maybe if you want to mull that over more, we could also defer that until Jake's question. Up to you.
So it seems like there are multiple questions in Martine's question. So we've got here, let me see if I can get a handle on this. Especially, so the types of categorizing revolutions, I can answer that one pretty easily, which is that they think that revolutions themselves cannot be divided like that because those tendencies are at work within all modern revolutions. So, for instance, their position on the French Revolution is that it promised way too much at first, that people got way too excited. They really like the Enragés. Claire Lacombe is going to be one of Horkheimer's heroes versus Robespierre. And he's going to say, like the mob in that sense, and like the Sans-Culottes and sort of the urban proletariat in that case, they were pushing a radical program. They forced, everyone in the assemblies, the respective assemblies, to adopt like more radical positions than they otherwise would have, and that they regretted and resented. Um, and so, like, I think that for them, Horkheimer will even say that, like, the reason that the French Revolution ends like it does is because it betrayed the truth of its original way too universal declarations and had to take them back and qualify them. And then there are all the fights about like price controls and shit like that. So in that sense, is it a pure bourgeois revolution? No, because what they think the modern revolution is is a fight about the possibility of communism and its suppression. And they think that's what bourgeois revolutions were. They solicited that impulse from people because the true universal impulse is socialist revolution, and then they killed it. And that's what they think the arc of bourgeois revolutions like follows. They think that's also why there's a relationship between bourgeois revolutionaries and fascism later, as Adorno will define it as, bourgeois terror is the definition of fascism we get In Search of Wagner. Um, and it's for that reason. It's because he's reading Horkheimer's Egoism and Freedom movements and the other pieces from around that time in the late 30s where they're going to be making this argument. So there are no pure bourgeois revolutions. Bourgeois revolutions depend on mobilizing people by teasing them with the promise of socialism and then destroying it, is going to be one of the theses here. Proletarian revolutions, also not pure. They tend to repeat and mirror bourgeois orders, not just the ones they're resisting, but also previous bourgeois revolutions, even in the relationship that they have to the revolutionary masses that they mobilize. And this is one of the things that they're worried about in the 46 political fragments as well. So I think like I'm not sure if we can categorize revolutions like that, or that for them it's a meaningful distinction because they think that this is what's being fought out in the revolutionary process, both in revolutions that we consider strictly bourgeois revolutions and in revolutions that we would consider socialist revolutions. Like they think that this is actively being fought out. Um, so I can say that there. I will look at the other questions here. But yeah, I will have to read your other questions. Until then, Jake, what you got?
I just wanted to make sure that I was understanding the essay after what you were saying. In my reading, is proletarian nation that refers to it should be taken up as our understanding of the United States, right? I mean, he says that the better and better situated the American working class happens to be, the better the vanguard for the oppressed nation, for the oppressed of all countries. And then he goes into the proletarian nation thing. And then that the proletarians of the industrialized countries feel themselves the vanguard of the colored peoples of the world does not mean that they are under any illusions about the possible imperialism of the latter, as exemplified in the case of the Japanese. And then he says that emancipation in colonial areas from Argentina to Pakistan is being carried out in a semi-fascistic and is thoroughly anti-Semitic. So I don't know, um, like abstractly, of course, he would want every country to be free, but I don't think that he sees any positive like dimension to um, movements in what he calls what the oppressed, uh, what the proto third world countries, unless I'm misunderstanding.
No, yeah, yeah. I mean, that is a good point. I think though the two things, because what I think I said in the presentation was that he considers this to be the fault of the non-existence of the Communist International, is the first thing. Like he does not think that there's anything inherently fascistic about it. He thinks that this is a consequence of what happens when the Communist International betrays its own mandate or fails its own mandate. And so it's an interesting way of pointing the finger at it's the failure for there to be like an actual international, a socialist or a communist international. The other thing here is that I think, yeah, like what is the proletarian nation? And I don't think that they name one because the US can't be it. Uh, yeah, I mean, it's for them, it's just not at this point. And I think that, like even when they're thinking about this potential, when they say that like the workers in the United States are better off than other countries, this doesn't make them less inclined to revolution. It puts them in a better position for it. Um, there's a weird way in which part of their thinking at this time, they'll talk about it as the internationalization of class conflict, which is that they will refer to countries that are like the oppressed countries versus those that are like the oppressing countries. And they'll use this, it comes up in Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason around 47 also, where they will identify as like what would be like which one of you is the capitalist, which one of you is the proletarian. They will sometimes break those up into two different like kinds of countries, like what we could call first world and third world countries or something like that. But I think that you're right. What it would be the positive referent for proletarian nation here, and it's like there isn't one. I don't think. And I think it's for the same reason that Horkheimer puts it in drafts for the Jews in Europe, which is that he concludes all of his drafts by saying, it's very I understand why he didn't publish this version of it. So I just want to say, throwing this out there, this is not me endorsing it. He's being polemical. And I'm still working through the material itself. But he talks about the question of like the folk or the nation. And he says, like, are the Jews a nation? And this is, the way that he ends that first draft, which again, it makes sense that he didn't publish it. It's very provocative. And he'll say, they can only be a nation once basically international revolution is achieved, so that there will be no nations at all. Because only then will you be able to say folk in the true sense of the term. Something like that seems to be at work here. So there's two moments of the use of the category of proletarian nations, in other words. One of them is, I think, that they are identifying that with the third world countries, with those places, even though they don't see necessarily anything positive. They're also thinking of Felix Weil's work on Argentina that he's conducting in the mid-40s. And interestingly enough, Weil's thesis is going to be that the semi-fascistic form that political events in Argentina are taking, he thinks that is because of the suppression of socialism there. So, like, again, I don't think it doesn't need a single positive referent or model. They can see this tendency, they think, which should be coming from what they consider to be, proletarian or oppressed nations. But it's something that to realize proletarian nation in its positivity would be like the sense in which Horkheimer says the category of folk would only be able to be said in a full, voice. This is also, they do this in Elements of Anti-Semitism, I'm pretty sure, at the end of the sixth thesis when they talk about like species being, would be when there are no more nations at all. And so I think that would be, like the positive moment, which is also why it would be retained as a critical concept and it wouldn't have a positive referent, which I think is one of the things that they're critical of about like Hitler's use of it. So yeah, I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's the best I can, it's the best I can do right now because it's a great question.
Maybe before getting to Esther's, just because I wanted to maybe note something on a similar point. I think you're completely right, James, that like the idea here is that precisely what is sort of imminently reactionary or like the reactionary tendencies in, say, like a peripheral like anti-colonial movement or what can be expressed that way, a sort of turn towards a kind of like internal national developmentalist repression and these sorts of things, is exactly an expression of the failure of a kind of international movement, or the condition of that is the failure of, as they say, like the American workers have to start taking shit seriously or whatever. But I think similarly, or like sort of part of that is that I wanted to draw out your point that I don't think they are taking up this notion of a proletarian nation as something that is like a valid descriptive category or like a fair distinction that one could apply to the contemporary world. They say on 8 that it has to be taken up, but its point must be turned back on itself. And precisely the sense in which it's correct, but would also undermine the original usage of it, they say is that it correctly describes the tendency of class struggle to transpose itself into conflicts on the international level. While for Hitler, the concept only plays the role of an ideology because, on the one hand, it helped cover up class antagonisms in his own country. And then it also allows you to pretend you are speaking for the weaker when you are representing a kind of integral, supposedly oppressed, integral nation state that will then have to, in the absence of this international movement, sort of undertake internally repressive actions. So just to say, I think, yeah, like it would be, I felt called upon to emphasize that when they say it should be taken up, they mean it in a rather specific sense that actually undoes the analytical and political sort of specificity of, or like integral implication of unity that the concept would seem to have with respect to nations. Robin, do you want to go?
I have a question. It's not in any way responsive to that question of yours, though.
Go
Get a
for it.
chance
I'll
to.
also say,
Okay.
wait, just I'll also say we can the original plan was an hour and a half, like to go to 6:30. So if anyone has additional questions, try to get them in. And if we end up going a little bit over, I'm okay with that. But yeah, so speak now or forever hold your peace until 2 weeks from now. All right, Robin, go.
Cool. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I've just been really struggling, I guess, with the theses on the domination of nature and social domination, which I know that this is a sort of common theme for them, but these formulations are I'm struggling with. I think especially like the way that I'm reading the thesis or the synthesis at the end and how they pose it. At the beginning, it seems like they just say the antithesis again and just say like natural relations of power explain social domination. And then in that last line where they're like making this argument about the reflection form of domination, they just say the thesis again. And I don't see actually where they ever arrive at a different argument in the final section of that text. And I know you have this bit in your framing on 50, which is helpful in sort of trying to schematize this, but I'm curious what your reading of that is, if there really is a different position here or just what's going on.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because for like this three-page little, fragment has caused me many, many sleepless nights, I think, for this reason, where I was like, I have to be translating this wrong. I thought for like half a year, I was like, I got to be getting this wrong. They can't just be saying this again. But I think like, so one thing I will say is that the only place where this is used, which is that Horkheimer uses it to draft one of his lectures for Society and Reason, um, which he doesn't end up delivering, weirdly enough, because he scraps it to just critique Dewey, because everyone after the first lecture wanted to defend Dewey, and he was like, no, Dewey's the problem, not the solution. But there he's going to say in his lecture notes, he'll call these theses, which is interesting, the utopian thesis, which is the one where you can explain domination of nature from social relations, and the realist thesis, which is that you can explain social domination by natural power relations. There, he also does not have an answer. And he says it explicitly. He was like, I just got to pose this problem for you. But yeah, this is exactly, it's like, what is the point of the synthesis that's not a synthesis, right? Um, which is like, why would we use this thesis antithesis synthesis form when we don't seem to get a synthetic, position? Even in, like the more sophisticated versions, I guess you could think of that kind of construction. Um, so yeah, I think that this is where the question is for them, it's about the problem that both the thesis and the antithesis have in common, where that seems to be the key to understanding what they think the synthetic moment is, where they say, actually, the problem is that the thesis and the antithesis are really not that different in a certain sense. Um, and I think that that has to do with, on my best attempt so far to work through this myself, is that it has to do with a certain understanding of the concept of domination, where both of them sort of have a concept of domination as second nature or a naturalized concept of domination. Um, it might be something where, if we explain the domination of nature on the basis of social domination, there's still a distinction that's being made there from nature that repeats in a vicious sense. Um, the problem that they're, especially diagnosing in the second one of the schemata of like, we keep trying to escape nature impotently, enlightenment keeps collapsing back into it. So that's why I think that for me, at the very least, that's where I shift to the second one. And I'm like, oh, okay. Because yeah, I think your question is great, which is the synthesis, the univocal concept of nature underlying the antithesis is the reflected form of domination the thesis attempts to explain as socially engendered. It seems like here, part of what they think the problem is like, what is this reflection? What is the reflected form? And it seems like it's between this monolithic or univocal concept of nature, where there's this unbroken chain of causes and effects that leads, from the beginning to the end determined by natural relations, power relations are. The other one, though, which is the other problem that they talk about here in the paragraph right before that, when they're talking about the concept of a catastrophe, because I think the concept of the catastrophe ties those two together, which is like the problem with the thesis, which is that we explain the domination of nature on the basis of social domination, is then you're like, okay, so how did domination get started in society? How did social domination start? This is the catastrophe language, which they say like people could say it's like the advent of wage labor, and then we're just stuck in hell ever since. How did that happen? We don't know, but we're stuck here. Fuck us, I guess. And so like that I think is one of the places where there's a real unity of the two, where even the first one is going to have a problem, the thesis. I'm trying to keep the thesis and antithesis straight in my head because Horkheimer inverts the order in his second lecture for Society and Reason. But the utopian thesis, we explain domination of nature by social domination, where they'll say here, I think this is the key, which is the concept of a catastrophe that has happened in nature or society has no place in dialectics. When it's relegated to a specific historical point, advent of wage labor, etc., becomes arbitrary and accidental. When we ascribe truth to the antithesis, which is that we can explain uh, social domination by natural power relations, it can only be in the sense we hold the very unbrokenness of history, in whose construal Hegel and Marx agree, and which has its true ground in the concept of nature this construal presupposes, to be the true catastrophe for whose origin there is no longer any room in the unbroken course. So this again, though, is the problem, which is like, is the catastrophe then for them? It's like they introduce the critique of saying, well, there was a catastrophe, now we're stuck in hell. And then do they do that immediately after? But that seems to be as far as they get here. Um, One could perhaps represent the synthesis such that the univocal concept of nature underlying the antithesis is itself the reflected form of domination the thesis attempts to explain as socially engendered. The only other answer I got for you here, because this is also a riddle for me, is that the first time I translated this, I tried to make sense of it by every time they said domination without qualification, without specifying domination of nature or social domination, I would substitute in one of those two terms. Because I was like, well, here they're talking about, social domination when they say domination here. Actually, it's just domination. And I think that might be one of the other keys, which is what is primary in both accounts is domination. And that may restrict the perspective that we're able to take um, in a way that precludes the possibility of following all the way through with either the thesis or the antithesis, which is that we're taking for granted something like domination in the construction of the thesis and the antithesis themselves. So that's as far as I've got. That is an insanely speculative reading of this, though, and I'm not sure how helpful that was because I just repeated your problem in a different way around the concept of catastrophe. And then I said, maybe the problem is domination itself, which again is not a real answer to your question, but it's a good one. I have no idea. I want to hear what other people think about this too.
Yeah, I have a proposed reading for that, which is much more deflationary, which is that honestly, I think you could probably just pretend the entire synthesis part didn't exist and just assume what it would be based on preconceived notions of how like Adorno writes. This is clearly Adorno, by the way. Um, that the synthesis is just classic, oh, it's actually an aporia where both of them are mutually constitutive and neither one actually has priority. Except in this one, he's explaining that through the terror which nature originally instilled onto human beings radiates back onto nature itself. But of course, like I know Horkheimer and Adorno will get into like an argument about this years later during a lecture, which is mentioned in the Dirk Braunstein's Adorno's critique of political economy. But suffice to say, any sort of attempt to impose chronological priority on one or the other is just pure, assertion. It doesn't have any actual basis. And so I think that the apparatic character is just that both have to be seen as mutually constitutive. And in the final sentence, it's just one sentence, he just says, well, the concept of nature that underlies the antithesis is the reflected form of the domination that the thesis attempts to explain as socially engendered, which is just to say, yeah, it's an apparatic situation where they're both mutually constitutive, and within the problematic, there's no possible solution to it, which is, I think Jameson is really good on reading Adorno this way. Also, obviously, Gillian Rose criticizes him extensively for this, for failing to reach the speculative level. So I think that that's like that's how I would read that.
Yeah. The quote that I just shared here, which is from the when Horkheimer says there is no answer, it's because what's determinate about it is you can't say which comes first. So, yeah, I think that that is definitely one. Although I do think that they are up to something a little bit more ambitious here, probably, which is the part that I think is still difficult. Uh, and it's something that they'll return to, actually, interestingly enough, to talk about like the problem of prehistory, which is the way that they'll formulate it later in the 1940s, which was going to be one of the major themes of Dialectic of Enlightenment Part 2, RIP. Um, Never happened. But they were concerned about it, and they were going back to like Marx's theory of metabolism and stuff. And Adorno was going back and reading Introduction to the Grundrisse stuff, like at the very end of the 40s, trying to think about this problem. So yeah, I think for right now, it's that we can't say either one comes first because of the way they reinforce, and that would be sort of the deflationary reading. I think that that's right. I also think though, yeah, there's the question of whether or not they end up endorsing just the thesis, the what Horkheimer will call the utopian one in the Society and Reason lectures, and not necessarily because I think that they take something to be really meaningful about the antithesis, where they say in this fragment, when they go through the thing and they're like, okay, the thesis is Marxist for this reason. The antithesis is Marxist for another, which is a very funny way of just explicitly breaking it down. I did not expect them to do that either. Um, The antithesis is Marxist, they say, insofar as it derives social life from the forces of production. It elevates the positivistic form of natural conditioning or natural conditionality into a dialectical form. It's problematic, consists in the fact it allows categories such as domination to appear as if they were natural. So it is another one of those in the apparatic mode, neither nor gestures to both the thesis and the antithesis, but they will have a qualified way of endorsing both of them. And I think that that comes out in the beginning of that paragraph there. So yeah, that's, I guess, all I could say to this now, which is apparatic construction. Is it going to be satisfying for anyone who's reading this? Probably not.
Maybe one way of slightly reinflating or motivating that apparatic construction it would be, and I think you were gesturing to this when saying that they're saying it's apparatic in terms of Marxism as a kind of historicist problem or something, like a kind of explanation of cause from Genesis, right? Like the explanation by origin, um, which looks, and so on the one hand, they would seem to be. It seems to me that this is partially a kind of opposition to state socialist Stalin type justifications of, well, you master nature and then social domination goes away of its own accord. Whereas they're saying, well, one could spin it the opposite way. And in fact, we somehow do seem to be in the one that is also the opposite way, which is that we remain mystified, even as we technically master nature, we remain mystified with respect to nature because it would seem that our social domination relations are reproducing themselves with respect to nature. And so it seems to me that what maybe they're getting at is a kind of like, this appears as an aporia for a kind of unfulfilled telos in a sense. Like if socialism, if the dictatorship of the proletarian communism are going to resolve this antinomy, or if this appears as an antinomy for us, then that's almost like a sort of symptom of the fact that this is a kind of real conceivable prospect of freely relating to this antinomy, or sort of moving past it, that has yet to be achieved in a certain way. Um, it's hard to keep track of which one of these comments are actually questions, but does someone want to maybe do a final question, and then we'll reconvene? Yeah, Esther.
Well, I know that the temporality of my question is sort of like desynchronized already because I posted in the chat, but it was sort of like let out. Um, I don't know if you can see it about the issue of Kant talking about revolution, because
Would you
there
like
was
me to read it?
yeah, like it was like the moment of the conversation. Obviously, now it's a little bit kind of off the topic.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
if it's possible, I would love that Crane comments on this in relation to that work and in relation of Apori as well, no? Because at least it appears that Kant is not so aporetic in that moment. So in terms of the possibilities of picking up all these works and moments from Adorno and Horkheimer in the work that Crane is doing at the moment are the feasibility that these theories apply for us understanding something. But if they are actually showing a position of receiving in which the aporetic is consolidated and, uh, you know, let it there suspended, then what is Kant declaration versus that moment, that moment, or no? Do they give us the possibility that we could have a revolution now? Is the right moment. We should.
Yeah, great. James, do you want to just take it outright, or should I read this older comment so people can uh, refresh their minds? Maybe James, since I think we're losing some people, maybe you can just say something quickly, and then we'll wrap up, and we'll see all of each other again in 2 weeks or so.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, this is the entire ending of the second schemata, which is the spirit of enlightenment, where they talk about how the answer that Kant provides is just as ambiguous as all of, the mysterious oracles and smoke-filled rooms that it's supposed to, abolish, Um, where I think that I mean, I just don't think that they think at this time that Kant, um, they think Kant discovers a lot of aporias, but he doesn't understand them as aporias. In part because I think that for both of them, aporia is not like an ultimate eternal problem. It is literally an impasse, and it's one that generates, if it's thought through to the end, a determinate way forward. Like this is where they keep using this formulation in their note, which again is not very helpful, which is like, and yet this antinomy itself belongs to the wrong world, which must be overcome. Um, and they'll specifically use this in one of the fragments for that was cut out of the notes and sketches for Dialectic of Enlightenment called Struggle and Nonviolence, where they're talking about the relationship to politics that the person who's part of the Communist Party has versus like the religious martyr who preaches nonviolence and the problems that each of those positions entails. And they're like, this antinomy belongs to the wrong world. And where they think both of them have like vindication in bearing witness to each other as guardians of the revolutionary truth, that both of them compromise. But this is all to say something like, um, they do think that if you determine an aporia fully enough, it points forward. It is a determinate thing. The admission of pathlessness, this is, apologies, this is the Gillian Roseism, is like the way that you begin to find a path, right? And I think that they're fairly consistent about this. This is even with Adorno's formulation of the aporetic concept, which is to go beyond the concept by means of the concept. Or as they'll say it in the beginning of Dialectic of Enlightenment, um, the concept needs to be it needs to conceptualize its failure, like in that sense, to totally coincide with its object. So, like, this is where they say the false is the index of itself into true, to invert the Spinoza's formulation. So again, I think that, in this sense, they don't, they think Kant discovers this, and that I think is part of the end of the second schemata, but they don't think that he points the way forward for us. Which is also the point that they'll make in the Juliet excursus and the dialectic of enlightenment itself. Of this problem in Kant, it's going to reappear in several forms there, but that will probably definitely take us way too far afield. But yeah.
Incredible. Well, I think that is a great ending note. Thank you all. I'm going to try to end more punctually next time, but super fun, very enjoyable. Hope to see you all soon.
Thanks.
Thanks, y'all.